usually we don't really see the soil much, or if we do, it's really just from above and only in 2 dimensions, just a top-down view. But here we've done a bit of earthwork, so we're going to take advantage of that to now we have a nice cross-section of the soil, and we'll be able to look at our soil in 3 dimensions, really looking at the depth and seeing how it's made up. Here, François Hirissou has kindly come to see us to comment on this soil profile. So we're going to take a closer look at this soil where we grow our vegetables just behind us.
The farm is located on what's called the limestones of the Causeverts in the Périgord Noir region. These are fairly old limestones from the secondary era, which are relatively hard to dissolve. We can see that indeed the soils here are not very deep, but there is still some soil. So these hard limestones, because they trapped clays when they were formed, when they were deposited on the seafloor, since there was an ocean here. These clays, as the limestone dissolved due to biological activity, were distributed throughout the soil profile, and so they make up most of the profile. It's a clay-rich, calcareous soil, rich in clay, but gradually this very dense clay here becomes less abundant toward the surface, because the surface is the organic, organomineral layer. This is where organic matter mixes with the clay and other textural components, and still thanks to earthworms and within those well-known aggregates. What's really fascinating here is that we can see this organomineral horizon forming, but at a very rapid pace. Why this organomineral horizon usually takes a long time to form? Because biological activity naturally proceeds at its own pace. With the principles we're applying herein, that we want to implement as part of what we call the ecological intensification of soil functioning. We provide a large amount of substrates to be decomposed by the food chains, which include animals, plants, microorganisms, fungi, bacteria, and so on. This very dense organic matter that has been added to the surface, we can see it here, it's starting to produce soil that is truly very rich in nutrients. Because in the soil analysis we conducted earlier, we saw that the soil's reservoir in what we call the CEC, the cation exchange capacity, was relatively significant, since there is one key factor, clay. Clay is a component that has a lot of negative charges, which will bind cations. But when these charges are reinforced by this huge stock of organic matter that you've added, it doubles, it multiplies, it doubles the soil's capacity to retain these nutrients. These nutrients will be released by biological activity and will spread throughout this environment. As a result, this environment will gradually become enriched with these elements coming from the top. And what's interesting here is that we can see that this entire layer of structural clay is colonized by roots. So we don't see the earthworm tunnels, but there are earthworms, we've seen them. And if we could see these tunnels, we would see that they distribute this organic matter all along the tunnel, and inside the roots will absorb all the nutrients that come out of it. This richness in surface elements will nourish the entire soil profile. And it's only in this context that we can hope to have soils that truly function in a very intensive way, not extensive, but intensive to produce massively, but with natural recycling processes. That's what's interesting to show. Here you have a horizon that will gradually move down and feed this entire soil profile. And in 10, 15 or 20 years, if you keep doing what you're doing, you'll have an environment that will become richer and richer. Here we have earthworms there, or a few of them. Is this very loose, porous, and highly crumbly structure, which is exceptionally favorable and conducive for extensive root colonization and healthy plant growth. It allows for the free movement of water and air. Well, this crumbly structure will gradually be found deeper and deeper over the years, and it will replace this structure we call polyhedral, which is a bit more angular. The idea by adding large amounts of organic matter is to structure the soil, making it increasingly porous throughout the profile. This is crucial because we have a lot of clay, which is naturally very compact, so it needs aeration. To aerate clay soil, you need to add a lot of organic matter. When people think of a lot, they often mention a bit of manure and so on, but for you, it's really on a massive scale. And that's really interesting because we're starting to see this organic matter spread throughout the the entire soil profile. We can only establish systems that function more and more autonomously where the plants produced on the surface feed solely from the environment by massively bringing in wood residues, compost, biomass cover crops, and maximum biomass covers to keep everything going and gradually build an increasingly deep organomineral horizon, but in a very short period of time. What would normally take decades or even a century to build, you can do in 10 or 15 years. And that is certainly one of the pillars, one of the future paths for agriculture, because soils that are very rich in organic matter, and I'm not talking about soils with 2 or 3% or even 4 or 5% like yours here. These are soils that are much more resilient, so they will be much more resistant to drought because organic matter retains water. And here we have a relatively low available water reserve because the soil profile isn't very deep, but with highly concentrated organic matter, it will hold on to the water. There will be a doubling of the available water reserve, so the available reserve is increased. Plants are more robust because in highly organic soils, there is intense biological activity, so beneficial microorganisms develop and help fight against pathogens. And we know that soils rich in organic matter are much less susceptible to plant attacks. Plants are in better condition in these soils than in soils poor in organic matter. Erosion, of course, is almost non-existent because these soils are highly resistant to water erosion and water infiltrates, preventing all forms of erosion. It takes a century to form 2 millimeters of soil, but it only takes 10 or 15 years to destroy 1 millimeter. Here, that won't be the case. So combating erosion, maximizing plant nutrition, and continuous recycling. And then another element that's really very important is that to decompose this organic matter, which is wood, which is extremely rich in carbon, with very high C2N ratios, you have free nitrogen fixers, the famous azotobacter, free-living bacteria, that have settled in to help with mineralization. Because to mineralize, you need nitrogen. And that nitrogen, well, it's there because the system works. Let me remind you that your C2N ratio in this soil analysis is around 7 to 8, which means it's not a pit soil. It's a soil that's very, very rich in organic matter, but also highly functional. And this was made possible, among other things, by free nitrogen fixing microorganisms, which allow this to happen as long as we leave the organic matter on the surface and don't bury it, because otherwise it would be in a noxic situation without oxygen, and so it wouldn't decompose. You always have to leave the organic matter on the surface and let nature take its course so that it gradually spreads at the pace of biological life. And so it creates this structure which, as you can see with the vegetables you are further along, is a structure that is very favorable for rooting and for nourishment. In real time, you have a soil that forms much faster than normal soil, and that will meet the requirements you expect from it. That is to produce a lot of vegetables because you've added a lot of substrate, and the environment, well, it's alive. So you have to accept that. Indeed, we are no longer in a model where everything is controlled, we're in a model where you have to adapt. And well, moles come back when they are earthworms, just like wild boars do, by the way. And it's really a problem for farmers who practice soil conservation agriculture, where earthworms return in large numbers. Now, their fields are unfortunately much more dug up by wild boars looking for protein. The entire decomposer chain is at work, and here the pH levels are relatively high because the environment is calcareous, with pH values around 7, 7.5. And you should know that the bacteria known as cellulolytic, ones that break down organic matter, cellulose and fungi for lignin, but especially the cellulolytic bacteria, the ones that drive this recycling process. They only function above a pH of 6 to 6.5. So the cellulose decomposing bacteria work well. There are fungi as well, which we've seen because these are well aerated environments, so they are less sensitive to acidity, but they are present. And then there is the entire chain of decomposition involving the soil fauna that is present. Earlier we saw wood lice, what we call the three types of fertility, physical fertility, which is the soil's ability to nourish plants, meaning the soil's porosity. Basically, that's what physical fertility is. It is established thanks to this organic matter, which will loosen the soil a bit. Chemical fertility is obviously present as well, because by adding a large amount of carbon, we attract nitrogen. And this nitrogen is the primary component for living organisms, but also all the other elements like phosphorus and potash. Phosphorus is absorbed by soil fungi, the mycorrhizae, which thrive in very favorable conditions. Potash as well, it also comes from the subsoil. So all those elements are present too. And it's really important to emphasize that by fixing carbon, you naturally fix nitrogen as well, because carbon, with its functional bonds once again, wouldn't be fixed if there wasn't nitrogen. So you kill two birds with one stone, you stabilize your soil with carbon, and enrich it with nitrogen. Gaining 1 point of organic matter is roughly 2,000 kilos, or 2,000 units of nitrogen gained per hectare. And this nitrogen, it comes from, well, from free fixers, from azotobacter, and even from legumes as well, since here. And where do they get it from? And they take it from the air, since air is made up of 80% nitrogen. And they are the only ones, bacteria are the only microorganisms capable of breaking this famous, this atom, this nitrogen molecule that we breathe, which is extremely difficult to break. They break it, as we know, at 25 degrees and at ambient pressure, whereas I repeat, it takes 400 degrees and I don't know how many, 200 or 300 bars to do it from an energy standpoint using diesel coal, right? So we can see the advantage of letting nature do its work rather than producing mineral nitrogen. This fixed organic matter is going to fix it in a very, very intense way. 2 tons of nitrogen per point of organic matter. You gain between the 3% you had or the 2 or 3% you had, 1%, right? 10 or 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and you went up to 7 or 8%. 8%, yes. Just imagine the amount of nitrogen you fixed there. If it's 2 tons per point, you fix 16 tons of nitrogen per hectare. The chemical fertility, it's there thanks to your organic matter, physical fertility, chemical fertility, and of course biological fertility. Because this organic matter wouldn't be in this state if it weren't for, well, the entire food chain that makes it possible to create it. If nothing was working, if there was no biological fertility, then what you'd have here is a mass of compost that would never have decomposed. On soils that are very deep, well, by doing what you know we do here and there, we managed to create a soil that is extremely fertile, and you can see it, that's what it is. And so this fertility is due to the fact that we add a large amount of organic matter to the surface, leave it on the surface, and let the soil function naturally. But with this human input, which is a bit, which doesn't exist in nature because it's the necessity of doing it really, but at the same time, we're not destroying anything. In fact, we're building something, and that's really a very interesting direction to promote, well, that we're trying to promote ourselves within the traditional agricultural world. Saying that organic matter levels of 2 or 3% are enough is not sufficient. We really need to increase them. And for that, we need to make massive additions of carbon on the surface. So these massive additions could be manure, compost, wood, a lot of biomass, high biomass cover crops, etc. But it has to be done, you know. And it's only at that price that we'll really be able to change to, put it briefly a bit of the production model, gradually doing without inputs, and trying to have an approach that's much more, much better adapted to the environment and to this model that you're using.